Let's wait for a couple more people to come in. I think we're nearly there. So, right, welcome to the third session in Thursday's ELT conference sessions. Thank you as ever to our sponsors, Trinity College London and Macmillan Education, without which this free event would not be possible. As you probably know, the event is being recorded, so this session will be available sometime next week or the week after that on English UK's YouTube channel. So do look out for that if you want to listen again or share it with your colleagues. If you want to ask a question, please pop your question in chat and Simon will get to it as and when he wishes to. Also at the end, you can come on camera if you feel brave enough and ask a question verbally as well. So yes, without further ado, let me introduce you to Simon Dunton. Simon has worked in EFL since 2006, and he's worked as, like many of us, I think, as a teacher trainer, academic manager, and resource materials creator. He has strong interests in diversity, inclusivity, online learning, and the history of English language teaching. But today he's going to be talking about reading a move to mediation. So thank you, Simon.
And thank you as well for that introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this session today. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box which I have open here, so if you have any questions or comments, do keep them coming in throughout this, and we'll maybe have some time at the end as well for some questions and answers. But hopefully there'll be a little bit of interaction here, make sure everyone's awake, so stay awake for the questions, and I'll be looking out for your responses to those as we move on. I'm sort of coming at this as both a teacher and a trainer, and I hope there's a mix of people from those backgrounds in the talk today. But what I wanted to start off with today was this quote actually from a book, a really wonderful book on race, empire, and teaching English as a second or additional language. But as part of the study, I really enjoyed this quote here when it's talking about how important it is that teachers are taught not simply what to do, but they're supported in thinking analytically and innovatively about solutions that are appropriate for our own or their own immediate classrooms, and of course in the broader context of the profession. So I'm hoping in today's session we'll talk about a little bit of theory, and we'll be looking at some of the scales and the rating scales, but also some practical ideas of things that either I've used in the classroom myself or I've seen used in the classroom, which are to sort of great effect, so sharing of best practices. But of course, we should always look at these things with an eye of, well, what would and wouldn't work in our own classrooms and contexts, which elements of this might need adapting to work for my classroom, or indeed for the classrooms of the trainees that I help train throughout there. And I'm aware there'll be a mix of people watching this from an ESOL and ESL, EFL background, so things will need adjusting depending on what your background is and what you're doing in our sphere. I guess to start with here, we should talk about the classic developing reading skills here. And here's my first little interactive bit here. So generally when we're learning about how we read, or indeed when we're training people on what happens in the mind, the processes and how we read, we talk about maybe 2 or 3 different processes, the way that we look at text. So I'm just wondering if anyone in the chat box can guess what at least 1 or 2 of those processes will be on my list here. So again, this is looking at how do we read something, how do we approach a text when we're reading it, whether it's a longer text or a smaller text. I can see background knowledge is a great one there. Yes, that activating schemata, that's something that definitely happens. Thank you, Matt, for adding that one. Any other takers here? I'm aware of time, so I won't wait too long for here. But as well as that activating schematic, you're absolutely right, Matt. That's something that we train and that we do in our classrooms. We also think about things like the bottom-up processing. So this is taking the little bits of text and the language, building that together, and then trying to understand the meaning of the text we're reading, the bottom processes. But we might, as Matt has suggested here, we're using a top-down approach, where we're using our own knowledge or our idea of what we think the text will contain to try and understand the text as a whole as well. Maybe it's challenging ideas of what we thought the text would be about, whether that's the content, the genre, etc. And then, of course, there's this interactive model, which is describing what we do when we're reading in terms of both bottom-up and top-down processing. So we're doing these things all at the same time so that we understand the text that we're reading, be it a long text, could be a news article, could be short messages, could be signs, and we're trying to make it understandable to us. And of course, something else we work on in our classrooms and as trainers are the kind of strategies, and there are two big words that I think, again, I'll throw it out there, see if anyone's brave enough to use this chat box. The kind of strategies that we usually teach during a reading lesson include, anybody brave enough here? I can think there's two, possibly three right there. There we go. David, thank you. Skimming, guessing the meaning of vocabulary. That's an interesting one. So working on vocabulary through a text, introducing vocabulary in a text. Yes. And scanning being the second one, of course. Yes, that's the big one we do here. So yes, we're all very familiar with these things that we might even name when we're in our classes and say, okay, here's the skimming exercise. We're going to skim this text for gist and see what it's about, and then scanning it for particular information, and maybe some intensive reading as well, that reading for detail, or maybe a fourth one here would be extensive reading as well, encouraging our learners to go out and read, maybe not novels straight away, but that's where we have things like readers, adaptive texts at different levels. And these, of course, all do help develop reading skills, and they're mapped very closely to the CEFR as well, which we'll look at. However, we very rarely just read for the sake of reading. We do for enjoyment, but even when we're reading something for enjoyment, we often share that text somehow. Maybe it would be in a summary, we would advise someone to read that text, or maybe warn them against reading it if it's a terrible book, for example. But if you think about the things even that we're doing right now, some of us are reading the messages in the chat box and we're writing responses to them. We look at signs and understand what they mean, or we warn someone else not to do something because we can see a sign. So it's the interactive and the integrated nature of these skills. Looking at reading by itself is something we do in the classroom. And I don't know about you, but students sometimes feel that this is wasted time in the class. You know, they can read at home, they can do this at home. And very often in my observational work, I see teachers setting the reading as homework tasks. And there's nothing wrong with this per se, but what we can really work on here is integrating the skill to make sure we're moving reading into writing, reading into speaking, so we can interact with these texts as learners of the language. And we can help our learners do the same thing. Something else that's worth mentioning as well, in their book on developing TESOL materials, Mission to say this, that language acquisition is particularly associated with the operation of higher order thinking skills. So just a reminder there of that taxonomy that we have, those kind of skills of the creating, evaluating and analyzing, not just the kind of true, false, not given questions, the ABC multiple choice kind of questions that we might find in a lot of textbooks, or that we might create ourselves. These are valuable, but again, Mission to go on to say, for the purposes of designing materials around written texts, i.e. something they're going to read, the learners, it's useful to consider activities that can be expected to invoke these higher order thinking skills. So again, we're integrating things in terms of the skills we're using, but also the thinking skills that we're using as well, those higher order things, so that we can really delve deep into the meaning of what's happening to the text, how the text makes us feel, and what we want to do with the text once we've read it. As part of this, here we go. My talk, of course, is called Reading a Move to Mediation, and I see a lot more talks out there now about this word mediation, which of course was in the CFR scale right back in 2001. It was mentioned, you can see there on page 14, a little section on it, and it's since been expanded. But I thought it was worth visiting the first mention of it in this, the Common European Framework Reference. Especially this last section here. So you've got this mediating language activities, and then we've got reprocessing an existing text, and that could be audio or a written text. It occupies an important place in the normal linguistic function of our societies. So again, it's, yes, we do need to work on the skimming and the scanning, those true, false, not given questions, the multiple choice questions, to help support our learners develop their reading skills. But we also need to help them mediate texts and convert what they've got from the text into their other language skills, into writing and into speaking. And as I said, and some of you, probably many of you will be aware, very recently, this has been studied in a lot more depth in the CFR Companion. And so what we have from 2018 here is exactly what a mediating a text could mean. And this is a really nice guide for us to kind of look at what we can be doing in our classrooms. And it's not necessarily about testing our learners on these things. So again, if we're doing exam preparations, yes, we need to focus on reading skills as we do at the moment, but it's about thinking about reading skills beyond the classroom and beyond the testing room as well. And so they've pointed out these, I think there are 7 of them here, different ways in which we can codify, if you like, what we mean by mediating a text. And what I'd like to do for the rest of this session with you is really break down just a few of those and then look at some practical ideas, again, things that I've seen in other classrooms, or used in my classrooms, both online and in the face-to-face classroom, to see what this looks like in practice in a language learning classroom, and indeed beyond the language learning classroom, because we need to be thinking outside the classroom in quite a lot of what we do, of course. So again, just to set that up, I'm going to be looking at relaying specific information, explaining data, translating a written text, and expressing a personal response to creative texts. Some of these are things that you may do in your classrooms already, or that you've seen done in classrooms. And some of them, again, they might not be appropriate in your particular classroom. I can imagine if you're looking at something like a skills for life kind of classroom, maybe something about creative text isn't something that you could spend a lot of time on, but then again, you might want to incorporate that with your learners, depending on how much time you get to spend with them a week, in each week, how long your course is, what their interests are, etc. But I think it's worth looking at just these 4, and I chose 4 for the purpose of this presentation because of time constraints. And also, I'm very sure that there are lots of knowledgeable people in this webinar at the moment and who'll be watching the recording that can think of many different ideas that would tick the other boxes here as well. So let's have a look at the first of those 4 then, the relaying specific information. So this is what we can see in the companion from 2018 here. And there are some familiar words here. We're reading for orientation. We're going back to what we had earlier in one of the slides here. We're scanning the source text for necessary information, which is what we do in our reading classes already, right? This is what they have to do, find the particular information, and then they might have to answer, it might be a gap fill, it might be an open close, it might be a multiple choice question of some sort. This is what we see in tests, and this is what we see in textbooks. But here's the next step of it, the mediating step, is that you're relaying this information to recipients. And this is something we do in real life all the time. And this is making the connection again between real life use of the language and what we're doing with skills development in our classrooms. So of course, we're going to be telling people about timetables, when things are playing, the prices of things, why someone should buy something or shouldn't, where they should buy it from, looking at these kind of things we do in real life. And we can create this in fairly simply put together classroom activities that take a nice amount of time, that include lots of those higher order thinking skills. It's an integrated activity and it's mediating texts as we go along. So let's take this is a classroom idea here. From an online class that I saw. So you've got 2 groups that you're going to split into, you're putting people into pairs, and you'll have a learner A and a learner B in those pairs. The learner A is sent a link to the local Odeon cinema. This group was based in London, so there was a local Odeon cinema, and the Bs were sent the schedule, the cinema schedule for the local Picture House cinema. So they both have these separate things open. And then within their groups or in their pairs, they were asked to discuss what they felt the best films for the people in the photos were, and then later what the best films for them were. And there's quite a lot of higher order thinking going on here, even before they start reading the text. And they're going to have to negotiate quite a lot with their group members for lots of things. Firstly, if we look at some of the pictures here, I mean, nothing's been given away here about the relationships between these people. So if, for example, we just take this picture here, I wonder if anyone would like to type in what they think the relationship is between these two people here. And this is something that, of course, the group would have to do together. Who are these people that are going to the cinema together? What might their relationship be? And some of the ideas that came forward from students would be things like their mother and daughter, maybe their sisters, maybe it's a babysitter looking after someone, etc., etc. So there's a discussion about the relationship between these people, and then the sorts of things these people might want to see, what would be suitable for them. And then they can go off to the cinema. Again, it's a kind of jigsaw reading, so they don't have the same information, and they can negotiate together about what is playing where, what would be suitable at times. What would be a good time for this young girl to be going to the cinema? They have to decide all these things together. So it's a lot of creative thinking, a lot of speaking, but they're still using that scanning for particular information and relaying it to a group to try and come to a conclusion about what the best film would be. And what was interesting when witnessing this for this particular picture here was that one group in particular were looking at a wheelchair access for this person. So it's no good just choosing a film. They then went deeper and looked at the screen and said, well, this screen isn't wheelchair accessible, so they're unable to use it. Not all groups would have that, but they were able to have that discussion completely learner-centered, completely created by the learners from very simple questions here. And of course, this last question here allows for a little bit of personalization. And the you itself is quite an open question, right? Because which are the best films for you could mean you personally, in which case you're then relaying some personal information to your group, or are you going to have a negotiation with your group to decide which film you would watch together as a group? They can decide that. And then the teacher has some really nice monitoring to do. You're picking up lots of language, using all of that emergent language in your feedback, etc. So it's a kind of a nice, simple idea that, of course, has application in the real world as well, because if you're using the local cinema, the local listings, for example, then they have an opportunity. Actually, they might see something that they really want to see, and it turns into an actual negotiation, a real negotiation, and an agreement for those people, that group, to actually go to the cinema and spend some time together outside the classroom. Of course, it doesn't work in all settings. It's an idea here that might need adapting for your classroom. To move on to the second of the four that we're looking at here. So we've got the explaining data. Anyone that has taught IELTS will be familiar with this, I'm sure. Those pesky graphs, charts, pie charts, etc., and tables. Lots of work on the language that they'll need to use. Something that a lot of people studying for something like the IELTS are not very used to using. Sometimes you have to fight with them to persuade them as to why they might need this language going forward, and there's a little bit of negotiation there. Yes, it's just for passing the test, or some of you might need it outside the classroom. But of course, it's also used in pictograms, explaining data, and you might find this in something like the ISE, for example, which has a little bit of integrated skills work here, where you're given some sort of reading text, and then you might transfer some of that data into a written text at the end when you're taking the key information from several different sources. So again, we've got here some real life situations which are quite good for us to think about. So when we're giving presentations, as I am at the moment, for example, you might have some sort of support here, like a PowerPoint slide that you might use to convey to other people, or you might be looking at PowerPoint slides and taking notes from those things, or just kind of maybe translating the data for the person next to you that's not quite aware of what does this actually mean, this huge table of numbers? What does it mean? I understand, and I can convey that information, probably whispering if it's a presentation, to the person next to me. But it can also be something very everyday. And what I like about what they've got here in the companion is that they talk about things like weather charts, which I think is a really nice one. And I've seen this used, and I've used it many times myself in something like an IELTS class, in the following kind of way. So if we look here, for example, at something simple like the weather, we can set up a very simple little classroom activity where we say, okay, we're going to go away for the weekend, and you're eliciting where would we like to go this weekend? Somewhere in Europe, okay, somewhere a bit further if you're welcome to go just for the weekend, and then we choose maybe 2 or 3 places as a class that we might be interested in going. Of course, as part of our trip out, a fantasy class trip out. Once you've selected those places, there's a little bit of prediction here. Okay, let's look at these 3 places. Before we check the weather on them, which do you think will have the best weather this weekend? Bit of prediction going on here. Of course, Barcelona will have much better weather than Cardiff, or Cardiff's weather is going to be absolutely fantastic. Why would you go to Dublin, etc., etc. And then each person in the group gets to check on a weather app of their choosing to find out what that weather will be. And the of their choosing is quite an important bit. There's quite a lot going on here. You've got the predictions, so your students are encouraged to they've got a meaning for looking at this data, almost like a competition. And you're giving them the opportunity to find the real data, something authentic, and you're giving them the choice as to how they do that. Will they get the same information, for example, if they check the BBC weather, as I have on the slide, as the Apple weather? So there's a lot of different varieties here where they're just looking at data and comparing the data together verbally. So again, that's that mediating information. It says here Berlin's going to be wonderful. And probably you're not going to talk about the whole thing, right? In natural speech, you wouldn't say, well, at 2 o'clock it's going to be 12 degrees and it'll stay steady until about 6 o'clock, this IELTS language coming out, where it will drop down to 11 degrees and then finally plummet to 9 degrees. What you're going to do is summarize this data information as well. And summarizing is a key point of mediation, where you're saying, yeah, the weather looks pretty good. It's quite nice. It's going to be around 15 degrees and it's not going to rain, apparently. Of course, we can change this from a discussion group. We can then use all of this information from the very beginning when we started this task, and we can create texts where we're writing, maybe even actually texting each other. And you can have, if you've got the facilities, on some sort of interactive whiteboard or a screen, where you can send the text onto the screen, which says, I think we should go to Berlin this week. The weather looks fantastic. You can even set up some sort of forum going on. Again, it would be quite natural to have a conversation between friends. But should we go to Berlin or Madrid? What do you reckon would be the best? Madrid looks wonderful. No, it's too hot for me. I don't want to go there. So you're mediating the information that you've read. It's authentic, and it leads to authentic language production as well. And this kind of language can slowly, if you want to, then move into more academic, if you need to go that way. The academic language that they may need for something like IELTS, which I've mentioned many, many times on this. To move on to the third of the few that I want to look at, we've got here translating a written text in speech or writing. And I want to make clear here, and so does the companion, we're not talking about interpretation, we're not talking about word-for-word translation. What we're looking at here is this, as again, this informal activity. I really like how they've written this here, where it's not uncommon in your personal, maybe your professional life. I can think in my professional life, or even when you're traveling, for example, I might be traveling with my partner who speaks a multitude of languages, and I pick up the menu and I say, I don't understand any of this. And my partner will be able to say, this is the meal that you want here, all right? Or do you want chicken, or do you want meat, do you want fish? So he can do the work for me. It's the informal translation, not the word-for-word translation on this. And it's quite spontaneous. And that can happen in lots of ways as well. And it even happens, of course, within English itself. We might see a particular sign, for example, that we're unfamiliar with, and we can give a quick, this means here, or you can't do this here, for example. So it's that rough approximate translation, getting the essential information into it from the text we're reading, that we're receiving, and that we need to mediate someone else. And of course, as we move up the levels, we can start talking about nuances. What's the difference between these little bits? Does it really make a difference if you say this or that? So a few nice examples that, again, we can run through in our own classes, or that can form part of teacher training courses, because we often look at materials together. right, with our trainees, whatever level it is. Maybe it's a CELTA or a CERT TESOL or a Delta or a DIP TESOL or something like that. We're looking at the materials and thinking about where they work and where they don't work. And of course, that's the whole idea of the CERT PT, indeed, to kind of negotiate and adapt, create and develop materials for our students. So this is a project that I've seen run a few times and run it myself, both in the UK and in Italy. And it was about sending the group out to go and find small amounts of English out and about in the streets. And they could be photographs of signs that you might have. They may have the written with them or not. And also posters. In London in particular, some really nice posters came through this project because they often contain puns or quite particular bits of humour. So the learners were able to look at these and say, well, I know this is a Domino's pizza advert, but I don't understand what it's trying to tell me, right? So it's something to bring into class and help them mediate together without having to translate everything. So what we can do by this is asking the learners, well, let's look at these signs for a moment. What is the main message of this sign? So if we just look at even at this picture here, underneath it tells us no smoking, but how would you actually say this to someone? If they didn't understand what that sign meant, would you say no smoking? Would you say you can't smoke here? It is forbidden to smoke. I'm sorry, but you can't smoke here, mate. Right? What are the differences between those? And that's where we get to the nuance, right, of the language that we're using as we mediate signs to each other. And I particularly like this one, not only because it's quite, you've got the naughty cyclist that hasn't followed the rules at all, but you've got quite an unusual word being used here. Would you ever, in fact, say to someone, you need to dismount from your bike? In this case, if you lived in one of these flats, for example, you'd probably shout something else at them, mediating the message that was outside your door. So you can talk about these things, and you can help your learners understand how to mediate these messages in different ways, depending on the context. And of course, this works in an EFL setting when you're away. So if you're not teaching in the UK or in a majority English language speaking environment, this can work quite well when you ask the students to translate things for you. So going back a bit to some of the other things that we looked at in this presentation so far, you might ask the learners to translate something for you. I really want to go to, I remember doing this in Moscow once, I wanted to go to the zoo, but I needed to know the times, the prices, etc. And you get the learners to get on their phones, look it up, find out, and they translate the information for you, the key information that you've asked for, the best bits, how long will it take you to go around, can you plan a little trip for me, etc. And they're mediating with each other, they're discussing and negotiating in small groups what they think they should tell me, and then they're mediating the information for me. From everything they've read online, they're telling me what the best thing to do is. Let's try a little bit more interaction here and something looking at those nuances. Okay, let's see who's awake here. First things first, this is the same message 4 times in 4 different languages. I'm wondering if anyone can name all 4 of these languages in here. This is something people will be able to do. Please type your answers into the chat box if you are awake and listening, of course. If you don't know all of them, just write the ones that you think you do know. And if you're watching the recording, I'll give you a few seconds just to think about any of the ones, any of these 4 languages that you recognize here. And I'll explain why they're here as well. This is something, again, the translation, where you can find something that's been officially translated into maybe the languages or the language of your group, if it's monolingual, or the languages, or some of the languages spoken in your group. And you can ask them to translate these short messages back into English, right? Some nice answers coming in here. I'm very pleased that lots of people are recognizing the 4th one, which is good. So we're asking people to translate things back, and we can talk about the nuances of lots of things, both about their own language and about English. So to reveal the answers then, we have Hebrew on the left, we have Hindi, this one, central left, Russian is the central right, and the far right is, as lots of people have written here, which is great, Welsh. They all say the same thing. Anyone willing to give a translation a go? If anyone's able to speak any of those languages or read any of those, can you mediate this for us? It doesn't have to be an exact translation. Of course, that's the whole point of this. I'll give you a few minutes or a few seconds to think about that and write your answers in the chat box if you have any ideas. What's quite nice about this from all sorts of language points of views, really, actually. I mean, first of all, you'll notice the two on the left, even though these all say the same thing, right? They're all a translation of an English message. You'll notice that two of them end in question marks and two of them end in exclamation marks. So isn't that interesting that they've taken different approaches, the different nuance in the language? What would be better in English? Is it a question? Is it an exclamation mark? Does either fit? And in the Hindi one, we'll notice here that, of course, there is an English word in there, and we have to ask questions about that. Is it because this word doesn't exist in the language? Is it too long to fit on a poster? Although it fits very well in the Russian here. Lots of interesting points here. Thank you for those that have translated and mediated this message. It is, as some of you may know, quite a famous Stonewall poster, which is some people are gay, get over it in this one. Again, we can talk about the different nuance there about what this idiomatic language means here. Why is it an exclamation mark rather than and why is it a question here? What other ways could we translate this? So, for example, if I said some people are gay, so what? Does that change the meaning in any way of get over it? So when we talk about translation, it doesn't have to be vast text, it doesn't have to be literature, it can be very, very short things, but it's quite nice and an authentic thing to look at real commissioned, authored, and that means they've gone through copy editors and all sorts, translations of things, which you can often find on websites, just, you know, the official translation, maybe not the automatic translation, but an official translated piece, and really work through that idea. I think the last one we'll be looking at today is the expressing a personal response to a creative text. And of course, a creative text can be a huge piece of work, it can be a shortened piece of work, it can be a reader, and there are lots of things. We find them in textbooks as well. So there are lots of sources that we can find here, but they are extended pieces of work. And generally what we'd be doing here is not reading in class. So this is kind of preparation work, homework, and the discussion and the writing all comes in either, so the mediation, either in the classroom or both in the classroom and then as further homework. And lots of things here the Council of Europe recommends. So it's explaining about what you like or don't like about something, describing the characters, how they identify with them, maybe personalizing it. You know, does it relate to your own experience? Why do you think this character did that or didn't do that? Their feelings and emotions to the text, and kind of the interpretation as a whole of this. Now, I should point out there is something here about looking at a creative text from a very stylistic point of view, and that's kind of a very different thing. And you'll see in the further reading that I've got on my final slide here, there's a nice piece that was published, I think, just last year in the ELT Journal, which was about exploring literature and kind of literature devices. And that's obviously quite an advanced way of looking at it, and it requires quite a high level of English language. But what we're looking at here is little aspects of that, but more a personal approach to it. How do we react to a piece of literature or a creative text, and why is this important? So I've taken one example here that I've used quite a lot in the past. There is a story in this collection here from Cambridge, this frozen pizza and other slices of life. There's a short story in here called Sweetie, which is all written in emails. And the main character, who is Sweetie, writes emails to all the other characters. So it's written in quite I'd say an unusual style, let's say, and it actually attracts quite a lot of learners because of the style it's written in. And it's not very high level language, although this is a level 6 book, and you'll have to check with the Cambridge. I can't remember how many levels they go up to, but it's kind of the higher end of that, I believe. But the homework is, okay, to read this and give them quite a long time to read it. It's only a short story, but giving the learners a good amount of time, a week, 2 weeks to read this. If you're seeing the learners every day, which of course happens in more intensive courses, maybe setting this on the Monday and they have it ready for the Friday, or maybe if you have 2 week courses, you know, the last end of it, and explain why not the final day maybe. And these are very sort of emotional questions, they're involving questions and they're personalized questions here. So you've got to read the story and able to be able to answer these questions. And they're questions for you to then talk about with other people. They're not true, false, not given questions. They're not, in what chapter did this happen or this? It's really personalized, and it's what we do with literature. You know, who did you feel sorry for in this story? Who did you empathize with? Who's to blame for Nikki's behavior? Well, we need to read the story to find out who Nikki is, what Nikki's behavior is, and who we think is to blame. And there's no concrete answer here. What will her life be like now? So the story isn't really finished. We're thinking beyond the story as well, lots of conversation. And that fourth one there, we're looking for those people that are interested in literature. We give them a choice, a chance here to talk about the style it was written in. Have you ever read any novels or stories that are written in this kind of letter style or email style before? Lots of conversation generated when these questions are answered in groups. And you can really dig down into the characters as well, because you can maybe pre-teaching some vocabulary or reminding them of some vocabulary. You can then get some really nice conversation about, well, you know, what do you think each of the characters looks like? What do you remember from the text? But in your head, how did you picture them? So these creative, those higher order thinking skills and those processes are really being activated, because it's not described in the story. You're asking them to think about their own opinions, taking bits from the text. What do they remember? What do they not remember? And how did they picture it in their own minds? And you can talk about the personality of the people as well. So lots of open questions here. And quite often readers have questions at the end of each chapter, at the end of the book. Some of them are wonderful and can be adapted, and others are quite closed. They really focus on those reading skills. Again, go back and read that chapter, scan it until you find what color David's hair was. Great, but it's not helping you in the real life, and it's certainly not helping you mediate this. It's just testing your scanning skills. Now, in their most recent work, or their recent book on motivation, I think it is in there, and I'll have to check the exact book it's from as well. Mercer and Dornier talk about making the learners care about the topic of what they're reading and about the characters of the things they're reading, whether it's literature or a news article, like trying to really engage them in the contemporary classroom. And they want and trying to get the learners to want to know more about what happens next in the story. It's a really powerful emotional attractor. And the more emotionally involved you are in the text, the more willing you are to maybe divulge. And you've got more to mediate, more to talk about, and more to write about as well. And while we're on the topic of writing, of course, I've spoken quite a lot here. Well, we talked about the text message, about reading into writing. I've talked a lot about reading into speaking as well. But of course, this can be then turned into a writing task as well. This particular story is good or quite right for it, but lots of other stories, you can write alternative endings, you can write letters to the characters before the story starts, during the story, or beyond the story as well. And you're really getting involved in what happens there. And of course, you're working on writing skills. So you might want to follow, if you're taking a persona from the perspective of one of the characters, or you're writing to a character, will it be formal, informal? What information, again, looking at genre analysis, if we're looking at this particular story, if we're going to write to Nikki, for example, let's look at how she writes her emails. We need to write something that's similar to that, not too formal, not too informal, etc. So it's really integrating those skills together quite nicely. So coming towards the end of me talking, hopefully there'll be a few questions at the end, or any comments, which I would be very welcoming of. What we're discussing here and what I'm pushing forward is lots of things that we do in our classroom anyway, but to recognize that this is a move to mediation. And for those of us that are in the training sphere as well, to really incorporate some of these ideas when we do input sessions on something like a cert TESOL or a DIT TESOL, that we're really thinking about those reading skills, not just the top-down, bottom-up interactive processes and the skimming and scanning. Those are incredibly important, and we need to understand what they are in order to be able to read something. But what we do with the text in the authentic world, in the real world, is really important as well. And then creating things that are, interactive and integrated. So just to sum this all up again, we're looking at authentic texts and authentic tasks around those texts. because it's all well and good to find a lovely, authentic text. And then if you're writing true, false, not given, multiple choice questions, are you making the best use of that text? Are you making sure we're making the learners use their higher order thinking skills? The text should be engaging, maybe personalized. Think about what your learners are interested in. Where are they at the moment? Where do they want to go? What texts do they need to interact with in their social life, in their personal life, in their studies, etc.? Personalizing it with the questions, but also helping them personalize it for you. You know, that nice activity of saying, well, I'd like to go out this weekend. Can you help me arrange this thing? Of course, if we're mediating something, we need to make sure it's communicative. Right, that's the whole idea of this. We're turning something, reading, which can be a very silent activity, of course, and we're making it communicative through things like jigsaw reading, but also we can read the same text, and with the right kind of questions, we can make sure that we are reflecting together, talking together, and as I pointed out before, we're integrating tasks so that the thing that the learners have read then becomes a writing task or a speaking task that's not about checking answers, did you get the same answer as me, but really engaging with each other. And while they're speaking and while they're creating and using their productive skills, this is a great opportunity for us as teachers to be monitoring, boarding all of that lovely language, sharing best practices that we've heard from the learners, but also maybe highlighting, upgrading, or tweaking some of the language that they are using. So again, I hope that's all made sense to everybody. There's a lot more to talk about on this, but I welcome any questions. I think we've got a few minutes here. Any questions or comments from anyone, always welcome. My email's up here as well, if you have any comments that you wanted to email me. And I will share my final slide in a minute, which has the references and a little bit of further reading.
Great, thanks, Simon. So yeah, please either pop your questions into the chat box, or if you want, just take yourself off mute and put your camera on, and then you can ask your question to Simon directly.
Absolutely, and I have to thank everyone again for your interaction during this presentation, and well done to those that were that got the Welsh especially. I was very happy to see that.
Yeah, it was good to see. We got someone.
Again, I'd just like to point out that these are just some ideas. There are lots of things that you could be doing and maybe you already are doing in your classrooms, but I really want to highlight the importance of sharing those best practices. If you're a member of some sort of teaching Facebook group or social media, if you take part in training, whether it's international training or within your institutions, your schools, wherever you're working, if you've got a blog, if you've got any of this, sharing these kind of ideas, I think is really important to help support people, giving them a few new ideas, but also that nice affirmation that, yeah, the thing I'm doing in my classroom, that's mediating, that's what I should be doing, that's helping my learners and developing their reading, their writing, and their speaking skills all at once. And of course, you get to look at the language at the same time. So please, you know, keep sharing those ideas. And I want to reiterate that a lot of the ideas I've shown today, while I may have used them in the class, I've certainly borrowed them from people, I've observed. Of course, I've asked permission and maybe adapted it from my own classes, but I think that the sharing of best practices is the way to go always. No questions, which is maybe a good sign, perhaps. In there.
Yeah, I think people have got plenty from the session. And,
that is good. So again, there's a few bits of further reading here. Some of the things I mentioned, but there are a few other things here that you may find interesting as well. So I think quite a lot of it is open access.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay, well, thank you, Simon. Thanks for that session. And there's some good references there to follow up on. So thank you again, and see you all later at 4:15 for the final session of the day with Silvana Richardson.